You are finally the king. For 25 years you have lived in the shadows of your elder brother and your father. But now you have made it. The world is full of possibilities and promise. What should you do first? Solve the religious tensions in your realm, relieve the poor, improve roads, increase trade, perhaps better the health of your people? Or why not declare war on two of the most powerful countries in the world? Hello and welcome to English Civil Wars from History Workshops. In this series, we are looking at everything and anything related to the English Civil Wars. The causes, characters, the battles, weapons, tactics, the role of women, the barber surgeon, politics, religion, and so much more. In our last episode, Charles, as Prince of Wales, had trekked across France and Spain with his closest confidant, the Duke of Buckingham, and a handful of companions. Their aim was for Charles to win the hand of the Catholic Spanish Infanta. But this 8-month wooing turned into a failure, and they returned empty-handed, much to the relief of the British public. To watch this video, click the link above or the one in the description box below. So let's take a look at King Charles's early wars, and I have to be honest, they don't go great.
Now, frustrated by the failure and their supposed bad treatment in Spain, Charles and Buckingham planned for revenge. James I, Charles's father, never declared war on Spain, despite mounting pressure from the anti-Catholic faction and the need to assist his daughter and her husband fighting for the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War. In the last year of his life, though, James's Parliament granted 3 subsidies of roughly £300,000. But these funds were given on the proviso that any future conflict would be a purely naval one. But war with Spain was not going to be James's problem, for in 1625 he died, and his second son would become Charles I. Charles's coronation, already clouded by his wife not being allowed into the abbey, was tainted by almost immediate criticism of his father's behaviour and that of his immoral court. And despite Charles's hatred of his father's bisexual leanings and shameful behaviour, he did share his views on the majesty of monarchy, the deference due to the crown, and especially the divine right of kings. So when Charles demanded immediate war with Spain, he expected a compliant parliament to support him fully. He wanted to punish Spain, protect the Protestants in the 30 Years' War, including his sister Elizabeth, as well as supporting the Protestant Dutch, who had been an ally for many years. But the start of the Anglo-Spanish War did not go well. In fact, the whole war did not go well. At the start of 1625, Sir Horace Vere led a force of 7,000 English soldiers to relieve the besieged city of Breda, held by the Dutch. The Dutch themselves had a garrison of 7,000 men, and so combined with the British force, the relief of the city was looking promising. However, Vere was defeated, and after a ruinous siege lasting 9 months, the city fell. Half the garrison of Breda had been killed, and out of an initial force of 7,000 men, Vere was forced to retire with only 600. I told you it wasn't a good start. With such a disaster so early in the campaign, and so early into Charles's reign, the new king wanted to strike back and strike back hard. In the autumn of the same year, an impressive sized fleet was put together, comprising 100 ships and 15,000 sailors and soldiers. Their destination? Cadiz. It was as if Charles wanted to relive the Tudor glories of Sir Francis Drake and his terrorising the Spanish on sea as well as on land. Would this new attack be the singeing of the King of Spain's beard all over again? Whilst this was happening, the Dutch, as staunch allies, agreed to free up 15 warships of their own to guard the channel. The start to the Cadiz campaign was looking promising, but then the Duke of Buckingham became involved. With such a fleet being required to attack returning Spanish treasure ships, to blockade ports, to attack Spanish towns, and to damage the Spanish economy, there would need to be an experienced and respected naval commander in charge. Well, Buckingham himself appointed one Sir Edward Cecil, a solid soldier, but no naval commander. You can almost see it coming, can't you? Well, just like the Counter Armada England sent after the failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588, this one was doomed as well. The fleet wasted unnecessary time on besieging a fort of little importance. This allowed the garrison of Cadiz to strengthen their already new and improved defences. These were much more formidable than the ones Sir Francis Drake was faced with in the 1580s. The English fleet nor the soldiers could make any headway against the defences, and they proved incapable of letting the merchant ships in the port escape. Even when the soldiers were landed south of Cadiz, the discipline was so poor that they achieved no success. Cecil, all at sea on land, and faced with rapidly diminishing supplies, could see no future for the enterprise. With no hope in sight, and very few captured ships to crow about, the force returned home. The dismal and expensive failures at Breda and Cadiz demanded a scapegoat and a public inquiry. Yet Charles would not satisfy the public and parliamentary outcry for a scapegoat. He showed his true colours by turning away from the war that he and Buckingham had wanted. He began to focus on the plight of the besieged French Protestant Huguenots in La Rochelle. But Parliament would not let the Spanish fiasco go. They saw a chance to get rid of one of the king's hated advisers, an adviser who had been a thorn in the side for many years, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. They began impeachment proceedings at once. Yet Charles, as he had done before, stood by his friend and against Parliament, and would not condone the impeachment. So what did he do? You guessed it, he dissolved Parliament. The Anglo-Spanish War, its cost in money and men, the king protecting his advisers, would all cast long shadows and be factors in the beginning of the civil wars. So the war is going horribly. It is unpopular. It is costing vast amounts of money. Men are dying at a grueling rate. As a king, what could you do? How about start another war? In France, Protestants were called Huguenots, and since the Edict of Nantes in 1598, they had been granted freedom to worship. In 1621, 3 years after the commencement of the 30 Years' War, Louis XIII decided to bring Catholicism back to the Protestant areas. Naturally, there was a riot, followed by a full-blown rebellion centering on the port city of La Rochelle. Unlike today, La Rochelle was the second largest city in France, a wealthy trading port, especially in salt, which was a major tax contributor. Retaking it was crucial to the French crown. Now, to begin with, England was looking at siding with the French against the Huguenots. After all, Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, was sister to the King of France, Louis XIII. I know, a Protestant country allying with a Catholic country to fight their Protestant minorities. But this alliance would bring France into conflict with Spain, thus helping the English dismal campaign so far. But Parliament would not condone a war fighting fellow Protestants. Buckingham himself did not accept Parliament's arguments, and believed it was the French who had tricked him. On top of the fact that the French were building a new navy that could soon take on the English fleet, his position, and that of the king, shifted. Instead of siding with the French crown to fight the Huguenots and have a new powerful ally against the Spanish, they were now fighting with the Huguenots against the French while still fighting the Spanish, and with the Queen of England, the sister of the French king. Confused? If you thought the Spanish campaign was a farce, wait until you hear who was to command the French expedition. Yep, Buckingham himself. Now, it seems the besieged Huguenots weren't altogether keen on having English help to begin with, probably because they knew Buckingham himself was in charge. Whatever the reason for the initial coldness, the people of La Rochelle would not give the English fleet access to the harbour. It was only after the first clashes between the rebels and the Royal French troops that the English were allowed in. But even with the use of a safe harbour, the English allies were still not being overly helpful. La Rochelle itself, as we can see here, sits on the coast, and the Ile de Ré is a small island just offshore. The population of this island, although a Protestant bastion, had not joined in with the Huguenot friends on the mainland. This meant that even before Buckingham could take on the main enemy, the Royal French troops under Cardinal Richelieu, he had to fight fellow Protestants. It's getting even more complicated, isn't it? So the siege of Saint-Martin-de-Ré began with Buckingham's put together force, a force that consisted of 6,000 English foot soldiers, 1,000 horse, 4 small cannons, and 800 volunteers from La Rochelle. This hardly terrifying force was up against the strong walls and defenders which numbered roughly 1,200 men and 200 cavalry. After a few days of light skirmishing and consolidating the beachhead, Buckingham began investing the citadel, but problems dogged his progress. His chief engineer, one of the most important men in the campaign, had drowned whilst landing, and his cannon, too few in number, were also not of a big enough calibre to do any real damage to the fortress. And just like Villiers' failed Spanish plan, disease set in. Was anything to go right for Buckingham and the king? Well, no. Supplies dripped in, and the reinforcements provided were too few and in too many cases of shocking quality. Sir Ralph Bingley arrived with 2,000 Irish troops, followed by a further 400 raw troops under Sir William Beecher. If this wasn't bad enough, a Scottish task force was put together, consisting of 5,000 men, but could not make any difference as it sailed straight into a storm and was forced back onto the Norfolk coast. November of 1627 saw the last attempt to resupply Buckingham's force, but it arrived too late. In a siege where logistics was to prove crucial, the French under Cardinal Richelieu managed to keep the area supplied better than the attacking English. In October, embarrassingly for the English Navy, 29 out of 35 ships got through the blockade to resupply the hungry garrison. On top of this, and the death knell of Buckingham's force, was the landing of 4,000 French troops on the south side of the island. With time running out, Buckingham decided on one last throw of the dice. The last attack was a disaster. The fortress was just too strong, not to mention the scaling ladders were too short. Buckingham decided there was nothing left to do, and he pulled back. But the French would not let him retire unmolested. As he began to re-embark his battered force, he was harassed all the way by French troops. Out of his initial force of 7,000 men, only 2,000 made it back to England. But Buckingham's failed attempt did not put the English off in their support of La Rochelle. A further 2 fleets were sent across the Channel to relieve the city, but once again they would prove dismal failures. Whilst back in England, still positive he could take the fortress on Ile de Ré, Buckingham was planning another attack. But this attack was not to be. Whilst having a drink in the Greyhound public house in Portsmouth, Buckingham was stabbed to death by one John Felton. Felton was a disaffected army lieutenant who believed that Buckingham was responsible for him not being promoted to the rank of captain, and had also denied him £80 of his back pay. At a stroke, Charles had lost his closest friend and advisor. And with the wars going horribly wrong and the costs spiralling out of control, he had to look for peace. Fortunately for the king, both Spain and France were keen on the idea as well. England would pull out of its commitment to the 30 Years' War by signing peace treaties with France in 1629 and Spain in 1630. These diplomatic signatures were met by dismay on the continent by Protestant states still battling against their Catholic neighbours. But perhaps more importantly for Charles, the wars which had cost the country so much in money, supplies and manpower were seen as deeply unpopular by people and Parliament. The English civil wars may still have been 14 years into the future, but Charles's attitudes, his defence of his unpopular ministers, his willingness to ally with Catholic powers, as well as his raising forced taxes without parliamentary consent, all would lead to a split with Parliament.
As we said at the start, if you missed our previous episode on Charles's madcap dash across Spain to win the hand of the Spanish Infanta, you can follow the link in the description box below. In our next episode, we will be doing our first deep dive on a character of the English Civil Wars, Queen Henrietta Maria, Charles I's wife, the so-called She Majesty Generalissima. Was she a Lady Macbeth in the Stuart court, or a misunderstood loyal wife doing her very best for her husband and family? As always, we really hoped you liked this video and our new series on everything English Civil Wars. Thanks for watching, please give us a subscribe, and of course, God save the King.